Good evening. This is Adventist Talk. So, interestingly, uh, was it exclusively the Sabbath? Was it exclusively for Israel? And how do we know this?
Yes, when you look at how God expresses it and how Israel safeguarded it and eventually formed their national identity around it, it was exclusively for them. For example, Exodus chapter 31, verse 12 through to 17, where God says unto Moses, "Speak unto the children of Israel, verily, verily, my Sabbath you shall keep, for it should be a sign between me and you throughout your generations." And the list goes on. And death penalty is included in there. And so the sign there, as I pointed out earlier, is an exclusive identity marker. It's like a wedding ring that a husband and wife share to express their exclusivity to each other. It is not an all inclusive sign, it is exclusive in that it was to be this peculiar ceremony between God and the nation of Israel. Now, it applied to Gentiles because provisions were made in that if there are Gentiles, non Jews, that are living among the Israelites, then they were also to obey the injunctions to not work and also to rest. But other aspects of the Sabbath, like sanctuaries, sacrifices, and that kind of thing, did not apply to them unless they were circumcised. And so, for them to have kept the Sabbath in full and to enjoy all of its benefits and the exclusive sign and nature of it that is served between God and Israel under the Old Covenant, they had to be circumcised and keep the entirety of the Old Covenant law. Not just the Ten Commandments, the entirety of the Old Covenant law. And any Gentile nation or people around Israel that saw their light, appreciated their customs, their worship, and how God was blessing them among them, and wanted to embrace their deity and their laws, which includes the Sabbath, they had to go through the process of proselytization. They had to be taught Israel's laws and customs, be exposed to the Sabbath, and then be circumcised, and then they become as natural born Israelites. And we see this in Isaiah 56, for example. The Gentiles who keep it, they'll be allowed to enter the temple to worship, their sacrifices will be accepted. And then the eunuchs are spoken there. The eunuchs, they were emasculated or eunuchated. Their male members were cut off, and so they could not satisfy the provision of circumcision. So God simply said to them, "Don't say I'm a dry tree and I'm cast off from your people. Keep it anyway. I'll accept your sacrifices. You're invited in the temple worship, and I'll make your name great and its memorial," etc. in Isaiah 56. And so it was exclusive to Israel, but provision was made in the law that non-Jews who wanted to be a part of Israel could have entered into this covenant relationship, their nationalistic laws, and keep them as well. We also see, for example, when you read ancient Near East history and the nations around them, you're not going to find anywhere where God is chastising or rebuking any of the non-Jewish nations around Israel for Sabbath violations. They are always rebuked for idolatry, immorality, and child sacrifices, oppression, and the list goes on. Basic moral principles and values that are embedded in everyone's conscience. But in terms of the Sabbath and feast keeping and not being circumcised, you're not going to see God rebuking them for that. Only Israel is rebuked for Sabbath violations. We also see poignancy in Nehemiah chapter 9, where God said there that he came down on Mount Sinai, he gave Israel the Sabbath. Then in chapter 10, we see where the Israelites, under Nehemiah's instruction, had to separate themselves from the Gentiles around them in order to be faithful to the law of Moses and keep the Sabbath. And then to dramatically highlight this, we see in chapter 12, Nehemiah chapter 12, from verse 15 through to 22, Nehemiah's Sabbath reforms, where the Sabbath had become very lax after he had returned back to the king and took some time to come back. It was very lax. And the Sabbath had become basically a market day. And when he came and saw this, he chastised the Jews, told them to reform, and then he threatened the Tyrians for bringing in their wares to sell on the Sabbath. And then he commanded that the gates of Jerusalem be shut on the Sabbath to debar the Tyrians from entering to do their business on the Sabbath and to keep the Jews within the gates to keep the Sabbath holy. This pointedly proves that it did not naturally apply to non-Jews. Because here you have on the same day, on the Sabbath day, you have the gates of Jerusalem separating the Tyrians who are on the outside, who no Sabbatarian obligations are placed on, and the Jews who are on the inside, who are being told to reform to keep it properly. And when the Tyrians came once or twice to still try to keep the Sabbath as a market day, or have it as a market day, he threatened them. I will lay hold on you, I'll imprison you, I'll take your wares or whatever else, and they stop coming on the Sabbath. He never tells them, you Tyrians need to keep the Sabbath. You're disobeying God, you're in violation. He rebukes them and finds fault with them for tempting the Jews to break the Sabbath. And he simply tells them, hey, go about your business. This doesn't apply to you, essentially. And chastises the Jews and commands them to reform. And so it was exclusive to the Jews, as we see over and over in various ways in scripture and secular history. But also provision was made that if there were Gentile Jewish slaves, Gentiles who were slaves to the Jews, then just like the animals, they had to rest, as the command stated in Exodus 20, verse 8 through to 11. The manservant, the male servant, they just had to rest, right? Just like the animals. And if they wanted to embrace the fullness of the covenant, embrace the blessings that would come with the Sabbath, this special sign between God and Israel, etc., then the male members of the family had to be circumcised. They had to go through the process of proselytization, and then they could legitimately keep the Sabbath with all its rights, its benefits, and its privileges.
Wow, you just gave a bunch of them of examples I had never heard of.
Yeah, great
That
examples.
was amazing,
Yeah.
Elce. That was great. Well, Myles, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, and I think I agree with everything he just said, and it kind of gets into what I was saying earlier as well about like the importance of understanding the bigger picture of like the biblical theology, because we were talking about Genesis earlier, and you're asking about when did it start, and this kind of gets into natural law, which Elce mentioned there as well, being written on the conscience, like standard morality, certain things that people, unless they've seared their conscience, you just don't need told. It's just intrinsic to kind of who you are, and God holds you accountable to this. It's kind of what he says in Romans 1 is why all people are culpable before God. Well, you don't see the Sabbath included in that sort of thing. People are not naturally convicted about one day out of the week, etc. And what we see, if we look at the bigger picture, is throughout the period of the types and shadows, and this isn't unique to the Sabbath, by the way. This is the case just biblically in redemptive history with biblical theology across the board. Elce mentioned Isaiah 66 earlier. That's a perfect area. Isaiah 64 through 66 is literally all foretelling of the new creation. He mentioned Psalm 92 earlier as well. Eusebius's commentary on that is excellent, the Psalm for the Sabbath day, and he points out and picks up how it foretold of the new creation, the new light, the new, there's a, I'll paraphrase, I don't remember verbatim how he says it, but he basically points out in there that like the Sabbath of the Jews was kept from evening to evening. It started in the darkness and ended in the darkness, but the new day starts at the dawn of the first day where the sun is rising. There's kind of this picture and imagery that's happening there when God talks about this new day. You've got Psalm 118:24. This is the day that the Lord has made. Well, a lot of people will just cite that, and think about, every single day, and that is true. But Peter actually in Acts 4:10-12 gives us a inspired exposition of that passage, and he applies that passage to the resurrection day. That's the new day that God made, and again gets into new creation and the second Adam. But all of that to say that as redemptive history is unfolding, you're in a period of types and shadows leading up to the substance. And as that's unfolding, when you get to Israel, more information is revealed that wasn't previously revealed. SDAs will talk about this, like Adam and Eve kept the Sabbath like Adventists do. No, like they're just, that wasn't, you're anachronistically reading from where you're presently at. And redemptive history was unfolding, and God was giving further revelation, leading to the ultimate revelation. What all of it pointed to is when God himself entered into the creation in the person of Christ, which is now the substance, not types and shadows. So yes. I agree with everything he essentially said, but I was just thinking about the kind of the natural law component of things, and just how during the period of types and shadows, things are still unfolding, and more information, like he said in Nehemiah 9, even, SDAs love to point to Exodus 16. That's before the 10 commandments are given. See, and they're getting this again from Puritans and reformers. But the thing is they ignore that what I just put forth is essentially what they're saying as well, that there was this unfolding of more information and revelation happening over time. And it's not just this intrinsic, every person just knows intrinsically that they're to morally, then you get into all that, like, can you go out to eat? Can I turn my lights on? There's a whole spectrum of stuff there, which again, all that stuff is missing. Right. You're missing the substance. So,
yeah. Okay. Elce, if you want something, if you're going to say something, I'm going to be quiet.
Yeah, I was briefly going to add,
yes,
about how
take your time.
They believe that Adam and Eve kept the Sabbath, but I mean, the absurdity of that thought, because again, if you're reading Exodus chapter 20, verse 8-11 as your launching pad to have this belief, you're using that law as the interpretive lens through which to look back at Adam and Eve's activity, there's a huge problem. Because as Myles pointed out, Adam and Eve were created on the sixth day. In order to keep the Sabbath of Exodus chapter 20, 8-11, according to the law, let's be like just now. The first clause says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. So for you to have the pleasure or benefit of resting on the seventh day in conjunction with the law, you have to have work for 6 days prior. And then on the seventh day, you're able to rest. And so if Adam and Eve created on the sixth day, they have not worked out. As they are created, they enter into God's rest. When did they have time to fulfill the first clause of the law? The demand to work for 6 days and then on the seventh day to rest. So it's very ludicrous when you think about it, and how myopic Adventist Adherents can be with regards to the law. They don't think, there is no rhyme or reason, there's no logic, there's no depth of thought or reflection in how they seek to understand these things or grapple with them. They are just brainwashed and spoon-fed some stuff, and it's repeated over and over, hammered into them, and they just regurgitate it without even thinking through it. And so when Myles mentioned that, it just occurred to me that it doesn't even make any sense.
Yeah, they never. I'm telling you, I've talked with a handful of Adventist pastors specifically. I've talked with tons of people just in regards to this. Not a single one of them stopped to think Adam and Eve weren't there on day one.
Right.
You guys all. That's what I'm saying. That's why I don't grant anything to this movement. Right. I don't grant you anything, because even when you grant, what ends up happening, in my opinion, is people concede things to these groups, in this case Seventh-day Adventism, that they shouldn't concede, because then it gives them what I call false victory or fake victory. They run this lap like, oh yeah. And the thing that they're running the lap on with their flag shouldn't even be a lap. No, I don't concede that to you, because here's why. You've overblown this. They've drawn in on one part of redemptive history, the Exodus, and broad brushed that out over across all of redemptive history and made this one portion on the timeline in the old creation, mind you. And then they've broad brushed that out to all of redemptive history. Not just that, they've broad brushed it out to eternity. It's apparently going to be the angels are keeping it, and it was always this way. And then even though days were created and all these other beings on these other worlds, these intelligent beings, they're all keeping the seventh-day Sabbath because they keep the 10 Commandments. And like the 10 Commandments weren't just they weren't revealed, at Sinai. And like Paul says, that the law was given to Israel. Again, this unfolding of revelation and information, which again, the 10 Commandments, Elce kind of hinted at this a little bit earlier. It's like they were the executive summary. You're pointing to like the executive summary of the law and drawing out all these large things that just are overblown. And so I understand why this topic is so triggering for so many former SDAs, because it's like so much is poured into this that at the end of the day too, like the other thing that's really annoying on this subject is one of their favorite arguments is, show me one verse in the Bible that says go to church on Sunday. They want like a verbatim, or show me a new command to go to church on Sunday. And the thing that's interesting about this argument is, and Elce hinted at this earlier, like the not stopping to internally examine your own claims. Like, is what I say over here consistent, or does it create contradictions about something else I claim? Because by saying that, you just foiled your whole claim about Adam and Eve. Where's that verbatim stated with Adam and Eve? Well, it says God rested. That's not the same standard. You said, show me a verse, like basically verbatim, that says go to church on Sunday. Well, show me a verbatim verse that says investigative judgment or Adam and Eve kept the Sabbath. It's a very inconsistent standard that at the end of the day, they're just like everybody else, seeking to utilize deduction and reason and these sorts of things that God expects us to do. And if you don't just cut it off at the legs and actually do that consistently across the board, again, you'll see that the Christian church was not in the dark on this subject, with everyone in universal ignorance on this for, well, they would say because of the Pope and, the man of lawlessness, changing times and laws and yada, yada. But all that to say, it's a quagmire. I would just add, if there's any Adventists that end up watching this, study the motif in the Old Testament of the new day. The parallel you'll also see with it, typically in the Psalter, is a new song. So again, Eusebius picks up on this in his his commentary on Psalm 92, which was a psalm for the Sabbath day, and I believe it's Psalm 95 is the new song psalm, which also gets referenced, not specifically the portion about a new song in Hebrews chapter 3 and 4 that Elce was mentioning earlier, and just the fact that look into what that new day is, because there's like, they love pointing to the Old Testament. But they kind of miss the things that are not as like, well, I can just read this proof text and see it says the seventh-day Sabbath. So therefore, when you do a little bit more of a comprehensive dig, you kind of see all the stuff pointing to something bigger. And the new day is actually a really big one, because again, like I said, Peter's inspired exposition in Acts chapter 4 and his application of this is the day that the Lord has made, applying that to the resurrection, is going to segue us here nicely into where you want to go.
Okay. What about you, Elce?
Yes, if I may also add too, in spite of the fact that the Sabbath incurred the judicial death penalty for the Israelites, we also see in the Old Covenant that when it ceased to serve its function and purpose for them, it was one of those rules that God just treated flippantly and got rid of as well. And so even the abolition of the Sabbath and the other feasts were constantly prognosticated in the Old Testament. And so, for example, Isaiah chapter 1, 13 to 14, when Israel was living in immorality, God says, I hate your new moons, your Sabbaths, your appointed feasts. My soul can't endure them. But yet you'll never see this is stated of, I hate the fact that you are adhering to thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, and those kind of things. In fact, when they were committing adultery and killing and sacrificing their children to Moloch and all of those things, God reinforced those moral laws and principles. But when they were living in hypocrisy and keeping the Sabbath and the feasts, because these were, again, nationalistic prides and modes of identities, God says, I hate them. They stink. I'm going to get rid of them. And throughout the prophets, you'll see that. That's Isaiah right. Chapter 1, see this in Amos. You will see this in Jeremiah. It's all over. And even in Hosea chapter 2, 11, where God says, he will abolish them. Lamentations talks about, Lamentations 1, how God abolished the new moons and the Sabbaths. He has caused them to cease in Zion, all of that. And so, which goes to show that, all of this stuff that SDAs and other Sabbatarians like them infuse on the Sabbath is simply not there. The way they make it this supreme, unalterable, inviolable law, this eternal law, God never treats us as such. He never does. Whenever they don't keep it properly, or they are violating higher moral laws and principles and adhering to this ceremony, he gets rid of the ceremony. He gets rid of the Sabbath, or he threatens to do so. Yeah. And as we transition into the New Testament, or the New Covenant, the new creation, we see in clear language where not only is the law is said to have been abolished and we're not under it, but specifically the Sabbath, those statements are made of as well as we get into them. And that Jesus Christ is elevated as this fulfillment of the Sabbath, the substance of the Sabbath, the one who truly gives rest, and the one whom we ought to keep and find this sweet rest and fellowship in.
Amen. The new creation is so key on this, just real quick before we transition, because something else you said there I think is really important just for people to think about, especially considering SDAs, because an argument they love to use is, well, because the Sabbath is rooted in creation, a lot of times if you concede that, which I will with them, because Exodus 20, even though it's not in Genesis, later on God roots it back in creation. Now, we can get into what does that mean, what does that look like, etc. But generally speaking, well, if you concede that with a lot of them, they're going to say, well, then that means that the seventh-day Sabbath is still binding because it's rooted in creation. I would agree with you, except one caveat. The only way it could be abolished is if there's a new creation. And there is a new creation. And so, again, it all goes back to understanding new creation. And so when you have that discussion with them, it's like you have to not just talk about old creation, but you got to talk about the new creation too. Again, this dichotomy of the first Adam, second Adam, old creation, new creation, they conflate that oftentimes with the new heavens and the new earth. And that's not what's being talked about in the truest sense. That's a part of this. That's a future thing. But the new creation's here. It's present. It's 2 Corinthians 5. People are made new creatures. Now, Adventists try to say that that's just behavior modification. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, no, that's not what's going on there. Same with Ephesians 1:10. We oftentimes talk about Ephesians as Protestants, Ephesians 2:8 and 9. But 10 doesn't just talk about the good works we're then to walk out in, but Paul uses the word, we are his workmanship. If you do a study, for good works, and Paul uses the word workmanship there. If you do a study on the etymology of that word in Greek, it's the same language that Paul is using in 2 Corinthians 5 that speaks to the new creation. We are made new creatures in Christ Jesus. So I look forward now to talking about Jesus and the apostles.
Well said.
Seventh-day Adventists are one of a handful of Protestant denominations that believe Christians should rest on the seventh day like ancient Israel and the Jews do today. They base this belief on the 10 Commandments. In addition, they believe the seventh-day Sabbath is the only day God set aside as a special day of worship. Adventists teach that in AD 321, the Roman Emperor Constantine issued an edict declaring Sunday as the day of Christian worship, and that the Catholic Church caved to the emperor's edict by shifting the sacred day from the seventh to the first day of the week. But did the Catholic Church really change the Sabbath day to Sunday? Is there really more to the story? We begin a new series that will be exploring the answers to those questions. We will start at the beginning, from Genesis to Mount Sinai, to the life of Christ, to the Reformation, through the 17th century Sabbath wars, all the way to the end of the world. We will be telling the epic tale of this holy day. This is the story of the Sabbath.
Now we're talking about Christ in this one, and how Christ dealt with the Sabbath, or Christ and the Sabbath.
Right.
And so we're going to start out with the most controversial question I have during this entire thing. Okay, so John 5:17 states, in his defense, Jesus said to them, "My Father is always at his work to this very day, and I am working too." And the next verse says, "For this reason, they tried all the more to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God." Right here, a lot of scholars, it says very plainly, John isn't saying the Jews said he was breaking the Sabbath. John says he was breaking the Sabbath. And Jesus says that he was working. So, scholars, did Jesus break
the Sabbath?
The Sabbath?
Yeah, absolutely.
I am not a scholar. So I would just clarify with that. That is a much too high of a
one, right, brother.
Yeah, that is much too high of a title for me. I'm just an armchair theologian. But Elce, I'll let you hop in, and then I'll share.
The spin to try to deflect from that is that, oh, this is what the Jews said and believe. And the text doesn't say any of that. John is writing descriptive narrative. John is stating clearly what Jesus did. And to appreciate even the reaction of the Jews too, is this is what they understood him to be doing as well. Mm-hmm. And also equalizing himself with God, because the Jews had Jewish scholars and rabbis understood, explained, and wrestled with the fact that God is not subject to the Sabbath. God does not keep the Sabbath. He can't, even if he wants to. For one, he's supreme, he's sovereign. For two, he's not subject to creation. And for three, given that this is his creation, his house, he can do whatever he wants on it, with it. And so it was common Jewish understanding that Yahweh is not subject to the Sabbath. And he violates the Sabbath with impunity because he's not subject to it as sovereign of the universe. And so this is why it was so alarming for the Pharisees that Jesus says, "My Father has been working until now. He's working on the Sabbath, and I too am working." So Jesus here is boldly claiming Yahweh, the sovereign of the universe, to be his Father, and arrogating himself the prerogatives of divinity. Meaning, just as how he's sovereign, he owns the universe, he's not subject to the Sabbath, and he can legitimately work on it, I too have these prerogatives and privileges. That is why their reaction was that way. And then the text goes on to explain how he makes himself equal with God. And he not only was breaking the Sabbath, but also doing that. And they took up stones to stone him. And so it is very clear when you look at the narrative that Christ was embracing it. And again, proves the point too, that God is not subject to cyclical Sabbath observance. Where the old creation was concerned, he has been in a state of rest, fellowship, relationship with humanity, and sin had broke it. He continues to be in that rest and invites us back. But in terms of working and sustaining the universe, sustaining everyday life and what's not, he continues to do that even on the Sabbath. He works. Days of the week are inconsequential to him. He's not bound by them. Whatever they are, he's not bound by them. And that's what Christ was doing here, just like the Father. The Sabbath does not stop me from working. And he admits that. They understood exactly what he was admitting and conceding. And then they start to kill him for it, because in their minds he was blaspheming, because we're looking at you, you're a human being, but you're claiming to be God. You're claiming to be one with Yahweh, and that's a problem. So he did absolutely break the Sabbath. And the other caveat of, oh, well, that means he's a sinner. And if he broke the Sabbath, he sinned, then he can't be our Savior. It is ludicrous. Because again, for the fact that God broke the Sabbath every week and didn't sin, so too Christ, his son, who's also God, can break the Sabbath and does not sin. God kills people and he does not sin. And so this whole, oh, if he didn't keep the 10 commandments, then he would have sinned if he broke the Sabbath. It's a very small-minded understanding of the law of theology and of Jewish perspective on it. So yes, he did absolutely break the Sabbath. And even in the Greek too, it wasn't a one-off thing, because the Greek tense that John uses there was breaking, meant that this was a consistent pattern for Christ of breaking the Sabbath, of setting it aside, of emptying it. And the truth is, when you read the Sabbath narratives of Jesus, he is actually consistently violating the Sabbath. In fact, that's one of the main reasons that they really wanted to kill him and rejected him, that he's from God. According to John chapter 9, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
He was not subject to the Sabbath as they understood it and as it should have get. He kept on violating the Sabbath because he was above the Sabbath. He was God. He was equal with the Father.
He created gravity. He's not subject to gravity.
Yeah.
God,
Absolutely.
God is outside of time. God is outside. Everything else that he brings to us is a creation of his.
Mm.
And yeah.
I want to put in here the clip from Wizard of Oz.
I'm melting! Oh, what a world! What a world!
God, Jesus broke the Sabbath. I mean, literally, you can just hear anybody out there, all the Adventists out there just freaking out. So anyway, Myles.
Yeah, so like I always when I think about that, because just like Elce mentioned, like SDAs bring so much baggage. I've done which I'm utilizing the help of other people, because again, I'm not a scholar. But I've done an exposition of this portion of John 5 in a presentation responding to Mark Finley, or rather utilizing Mark Finley as an example, who of course is making all the standard claims about the Sabbath, etc. And this is one of the passages I think is the strongest to point out a number of errors with the SDA understanding, because I'm of the opinion that the my Father's working until now and I am working isn't just referring to the healing that took place there on the Sabbath, but is also talking about the work of redemption. It evidences that the rest that God entered into at creation was not just a ceasing of rest indefinitely. It was a specific rest. There's not ex nihilo creation taking place anymore. But God was still doing things. That's very clear from just reading the biblical narrative. And so it evidences this fact that God can be doing something and is doing something, and that work was would have been essentially equivalent to, they would have said, God is breaking the Sabbath then. You're breaking the Sabbath then, because the Father has been, or he's telling them the Father has been working this entire time, and I am working as well, which, to Elce's point, in that sense, would be violating the Sabbath. Now, like he said, SDAs are going to hear this and think, you're saying that Jesus then is a sinner. But no, in the broader point of what I think is going on is that Jesus is actually demonstrating the principle that, well, it's like when they tried to trap him and they ask him, or Jesus rhetorically then asks them, well, if one of you, if your mule gets stuck in a ditch on the Sabbath, are you just going to leave it there to die? Well, they're stuck in a rock and a hard place, because, well, no, they're not. And he demonstrated that acts of mercy are actually in accordance with the whole purpose of what it's actually all about. It's not about this like real, which is what the tradition of the elders eventually, and still is around to this day, developed into. It's just like, well, can we flip a light switch on? Can we put our sandals on? Can we do this? Can we turn a doorknob? Can we electricity, a fire, all these sorts of things? And I think Jesus is actually demonstrating the point that I would agree in the sense that like he would have violated what the Jews understood to be Sabbath keeping, but actually made the broader point and understanding that there's something bigger that's going on here. I mean, he's healing a man, and these individuals would have known the Old Testament scriptures. Can't remember the specific psalm. I guess I could Google on our website, but all throughout the Psalms, it says, for example, that Yahweh is the one who heals. He's the one that can do these things. So he's not just... Elce pointed out how he's essentially equating himself with God. Well, that's another area. The fact that he's doing this healing is in and of itself. So it's like he's just constantly saying he's Yahweh through the forgiving of sins, the healing of people. And then he says something else later on in the passage. Down where he's, because then he transitions into talk, because they come to him afterward, and he says, all the judgment's been given to me. The Father has given all judgment to the Son, and those who believe on the Son have passed from death to life. They've already come into judgment and have passed from death to life. And so he just continues building on this theme of equating himself ultimately with God.
Yeah.
Yes.
Anybody?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. He not only equates himself with God. I mean, forget about the Sabbath. I mean, comparing yourself to God,
That's right.
the Sabbath's kind of
right.
You know,
Well, that's why I don't think. Sorry, that's why I don't think the central focus is like, it is a theme because it's talking about an event that took place on the Sabbath. But I think this is one of those areas where, and it's easy to do this. To be fair, it's not just SDAs that do this. It's easy to like find pericopes where something is mentioned, and to think that that's like the central focus of what the author is actually getting at. But like even the heading, which I know the headings are not inspired, they're not scripture, but like in the ESV, it's the healing at the pool on the Sabbath. So, okay, yeah, the Sabbath is mentioned, but man, I've heard, and Elce can attest to this too, I've heard all sorts of extractions out of this. That's like, what? The whole flow of the entire chapter, while yes, the Sabbath is mentioned, the entire flow of the whole chapter is talking about Jesus' divinity. All the way through to chapter almost 30. The first 30 verses is utilizing two stories, which are really one story, because Jesus starts by doing this healing. The man takes up his mat and walks. So that's a second thing now. So now he told somebody else to apparently break the Sabbath. And basically shows that, well, no, you're just missing it. You're missing the point, because acts of mercy and acts of necessity, the work that I'm doing, the work that my Father and I are doing, that's the ultimate work and act of necessity. And we've been doing this. Again, I think that there's a biblical theology around even the plan of salvation. All the way back to Adam and Eve, there wasn't this, oh, God got taken by surprise and then had to come up with a plan B. No. And, you'll get Adventists that are like, well, that's Calvinism. No, buddy. You're equating everything now. It's amazing the things I learned in the modern day of what is all of a sudden Calvinism now. Like, you object to this great controversy idea of a plan B. Well, that's Calvinism. Well, no, it's not. And so I think that there's actually an unfolding that is essentially taking place, and what Jesus is then demonstrating here is all of these ways that he is saying essentially that he is God. And that's really the true focus. But it's easy for some groups like the SDAs to come here and start extracting I've heard all sorts of stuff extracted out of this.
Yes.
Yeah. Literally, we could just have 4 or 5 days on Jesus and the Sabbath, but let's just go to some main things that Adventists are always asking. Okay, so was Christ giving us an example in keeping the Sabbath for us to do? You know, the Sabbath was not made, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Jesus' tradition was to go to the synagogue on the Sabbath. And so, this whole thing, every single text they'll extract as, God is showing us an example by going to church or going to whatever it is, resting on the Sabbath, so that we can,
This is why I always, again, refuse to concede things to them, because this is an area that backfires on them so badly. Couple things. When Jesus was going to the synagogue, it shows that Adventists have not been taught the distinction and difference between the temple and the synagogue. The synagogue and the temple were not the same thing. They'll point to these passages where it says Paul went into the synagogues on the Sabbath and reasoned. They'll list out every time it mentions Paul going to the synagogue, and they equate that to Paul was keeping the Sabbath, not understanding, no, Paul was doing evangelism. Mm-hmm. Paul was going to evangelize. He wasn't going to worship Jesus with people who rejected Jesus. Paul was going there to evangelize, which then begs the question, what day and when was Paul in church if it was on the Sabbath that he was there reasoning in the synagogue with the Jews? But as it pertains to Mark 2:28, this backfires on them. They love God made, Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. This, again, is an area where I'll just concede that to you. Sure, let's concede that without getting into the nitty gritty of like, well, I do agree with that, but here's the caveat and like all that stuff. I'll just agree with you. In your guys' system, you tell us the angels were keeping the Sabbath. You're telling us all these beings on other worlds are keeping the Sabbath. But Jesus said it's made for who? Man. And not just that, but it was made. It's made. It's not eternal. It's not eternal. Yeah, it's made for man. So that backfires because they overextend it. But the issue that they have and that they fail to recognize is, yes, Jesus did keep the Sabbath as a Jew. He was a faithful Jew. However, all of the documented and dated cases of Jesus meeting with his people post-resurrection is on the first day. There are enough accountings that are dated in the New Testament to fill every first day of the 40 days before the ascension. So when SDAs talk about Jesus keeping the Sabbath day or the seventh day Sabbath, they miss that Jesus changed this habit. We have 0 instances of him keeping the seventh day Sabbath post-resurrection. So if it was this big thing, like they've drawn it out to it's the dividing line, the seal of God. This is apostolic in origin, and we've restored this. Why was there no attempt by any apostle to document down any of this? They don't understand that Jesus instituted this with his apostles. He's the one that started the practice of the first day with his apostles. And it's not just what the SDAs believe, but on a different day. No. That's a whole different discussion. But the point being, Jesus changed that habit post-resurrection.
If I may add, going back to the Sabbath narratives in the Gospels, we don't see Christ setting an example of Sabbath keeping. In all of those examples of or Sabbath narratives in the Gospels, we see where Christ is challenging Jewish understanding of the Sabbath, and he's actually using the Sabbath as a vehicle to point to himself as one who is greater than the Sabbath, as one who gives rest, as one who's above the Sabbath, and as one who fulfills it. And so the famous statement in Matthew 11:28 to 29, come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, I will give you rest. He made that statement on a Sabbath because the context or the pericope of that is from Matthew 11 through to Matthew chapter 12, verse 12, where he immediately heals a man and he gets into a confrontation with the religious leaders. And then he tells them, someone greater than the temple is here. When you understand that the Sabbath was tied to the temple, he's actually telling you that he is greater than the Sabbath. He can dictate what are acceptable activities on the Sabbath. And he is the one who actually gives that rest to the soul, and not this day that they looked forward to give them rest.
Amen.
The Jews had idolized the Sabbath in the same way that SDs idolize it today.
Yeah.
And in all of those narratives, he's shifting attention and focus from the Sabbath to himself. In the rest of Matthew,
come unto me,
that.
all you who labor. Come unto me, all you who labor, and I will give you rest.
Absolutely. In Mark chapter 2 there, a lot is happening there. But ultimately, he's telling them that he's Lord of the Sabbath, just as how he is Lord of every other day of the week. And man is above the Sabbath. The Sabbath is not above man. And ironically, SDAs quote this to subject man to the Sabbath. Whereas Christ made the statement to put man above the Sabbath. And he's, of course, as a case law too, he's justifying his disciples breaking the Sabbath to fulfill their needs. And his reference to the priests in the temple in the Old Covenant, who, by the way, had to violate it every week with the plethora of sacrifices they had to offer. And then David and the shewbread, etc. And then he says, the Sabbath was made for the man, not the man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is Lord of it. He uses those case laws to show that he and the disciples are above the ceremony. They're engaged in God's work. They can set it aside to fulfill their needs, etc. John 5, we had looked at that. John chapter 9. All of these instances of the Sabbath, we don't see Christ setting an example of Sabbath keeping. Were this the case, going by what the Old Testament reveals about keeping the Sabbath, these are the things that he should be reinforcing. Stay home, stay in your tent. Don't do any form of work. It forbids any work, indefinite, any work. Exodus 20. Then the death penalty. That's why the Jews tried to kill him several times. As he broke it, the death penalty, you should die. But we don't see Christ doing that. Jeremiah 17, you should not bear a burden on the Sabbath. And of course, the definition of burden is wild and subjective. But Christ telling the man, carry a burden, his mat on the Sabbath. So he's not setting an example. And in Luke chapter 4, 16, again, SDAs idolize the Sabbath so much they stuck right there. When the fact is, that passage, that narrative on the Sabbath is revealing Christ to be the Jubilee Sabbath, the ultimate Sabbath, the fulfillment of the law. Right. It is not about him going to church on the Sabbath as an example for everybody to do the same. In fact, you will not find anywhere in the law where synagogue attendance was mandated for the Sabbath. That became a custom in the 2nd century during the Antiochus Epiphany, the 2nd century BC era, where because they were so scattered, they were being persecuted, and they started the synagogues as a means of keeping Judaism alive and reading Torah, debating it, and places of prayer. And again, as a Jew, subject to the law under it, he did the same thing. That was customary. So he did that, and he capitalized on that as an opportunity to show, hey guys, the Jubilee is here, the ultimate Sabbath is here, the fulfillment is here. because he picks up the scroll. He deliberately finds Isaiah 60, I think is 61. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to preach the gospel, the good news, etc. Bind, loose the prisoners and what have you. And then after that he says, this day, today, this script is fulfilled in your hearing.
Yeah.
That there was a Jubilee Sabbath.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was the Jubilee when those who were in debt had to be forgiven, and there was to be this nationalistic celebration of God's favor upon his people, God's graciousness. And Christ says, I am the fulfillment of this. So he actually used that to show he is the ultimate Sabbath.
Yeah.
But they are stuck, transfixed on just the inconsequential peripheries.
Yeah.
That he went to the synagogue on a Sabbath. They missed the entire fact that he says, hey, the Sabbath, the Jubilee is referring to me. And that's what the passage is about. And they were so enraged at him saying that, they run him out of the synagogue and they drove him straight to the brow of the hill on which the synagogue town was built. And they tried to throw him over to kill him. Because how dare he says he's the Jubilee, he's the Sabbath, he's the fulfillment of these things. That's what the passage is about. It's not about him being an example of Sabbath keeping, etc. And so, no, we don't see Christ as an example of Sabbath keeping. In all of those instances, he's pointing to himself as the greater fulfillment, the ultimate Sabbath, and the one who's over it, and man should not be a slave to it.